First up, we have a panel on crisis communications in the 24-hour news cycle with Twitter, Facebook, and all other types of media, constantly happening at all times of the day. We as PR professionals need to know how to react in this media landscape. So we have a really excellent panel coming up. Please welcome Steve Barrett, and a special shout out to Steve, who just got back from Turkey. He's joining us here today, which is amazing. Steve Barrett from PRWeek, Julie Townsend from ABC News, and also, thankfully, no crises came up, and she's able to join us, which is amazing. Tony Loke from Shandwick, and Rich Silverman from MUFG in the Americas. Please welcome this esteemed panel.
We averted our first crisis. That was well done. Well done, Natan. As I was saying, thank you, Megan. Great to be here. Great to be with you all. Got a great panel in front of us for part of Communications Week, which reminds me, actually, the last panel I moderated was during Advertising Week, less than 3 weeks ago, and it was someone called Harvey Weinstein on the panel, and talking about brand filmmaking. So that just goes to show you how quickly a crisis can engulf a brand, whether that's a personal brand or an organization or a company, and how you can go from, I'm not going to say hero, but you can go from being a well-respected brand or a power player in your space from, frankly, having your career or your brand completely ruined. That was actually an old-fashioned piece of journalism by the New York Times, but the conversation really was played out on social media, and it continues to be, and we have things like the Me Too meme continuing the debate around that and the issues raised by it. So that is going to be the context of a lot of our discussion. I don't want to get into the whys and wherefores of that particular discussion, but it shows how powerful social media can be. So we've got a great panel to discuss a few of these issues. We've got Julie Townsend, who's VP of Communications at ABC, Tony Loke, VP of Shandwick. He tells me he doesn't do rapping as well, and he's heard that joke 100,000 times. And Rich Silverman, who's Corporate Comms Director at Mitsubishi UFJ, which if you haven't heard of it, is the 5th largest bank in the world. So obviously got a global perspective and a financial communications perspective. We're going to be talking about crisis communications in the 24-hour news cycle. So folks, in that context, what do you do when that proverbial SHIT hits the fan and you find yourself in the midst of a crisis like that? Julie, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. I'm incredibly fortunate to work in the middle of a newsroom with some of the very best journalists in the world. And one of the things that I see that drives them, that frustrates them, is when they simply don't hear back from people. So I feel like one of the most important things that we can do is simply to respond quickly, even when it's to say, I don't have any information yet, but I will get right back to you just as soon as I do. And then the machinery, you go into motion. You, like a journalist would, gather your facts. You figure out what tough questions are going to be asked, and then start to get feedback on any of the ways you think you might respond.
As a rejoinder to Julie, coming from the opposite end, well, from the other side of counselors to our clients in the corporate suite, the first thing we do when we see something coming down the pipe is stop the train. What do we know is happening? Who knows what? And just get all your facts together, because before you can do anything else, you just have to know what the situation is, and you just have to gather all your facts. And it is best to call and say, hey, we heard you, and we'll get back to you, but you really need to regroup.
Yeah, we can get into the specifics of that, because there is a temptation in this world to react immediately, isn't there, and to have a knee-jerk reaction. So, Rich, do you want to build on that, especially with a global hat on and in a highly regulated industry as well?
Yeah, there's no such thing as a knee-jerk reaction in my world. I think PR professionals often will put together a holding statement, but that, I think, satisfies the internal folks that don't really get it more than it does provide a solution for whatever the problem is. Oftentimes, if you have a holding statement, which I'm going to assume that most people know what that is. It's something that you prepare beforehand in the event of some kind of crisis. You still want to check with, depending on the level of the crisis, you could be checking with the CEO. You're certainly going to be talking to corporate lawyers, at least in the corporate world. And you're going to be talking to the other PR professionals that you work with. And even though you have that holding statement and it went through 5 different lawyers and went through the whole process of approvals, you still may want to come up with something else, because as much as you want to prepare a statement or something to say for a crisis that comes down the pipe, you can never fully anticipate exactly what that's going to be.
If you look at something like the United Airlines crisis, for example, it felt like their first statement was totally, had totally the wrong tone, and it probably felt like it was much too dictated by lawyers, by HR people, and obviously you've got to consult with those people. But how do you balance that, doing right by the lawyers and the regulations, but also actually doing the right thing and putting out a statement that is commensurate with the crisis?
Well, I think one of the things that you learn over time with experience is that you can push back. Oftentimes, particularly earlier in my career, you looked up at some of these lawyers and you thought that their word was God, and you just were afraid almost to dispute any of the things that they said. But over time, you realize that what a lawyer says might be fine from a legal perspective, but that's not exactly the same thing that you want to project out to the public at large. So you either have to develop a good relationship with the lawyers and the other people that have a say in the whole process, or you just have to push back and say, that's just not going to work.
And, I think we're also in this world of social media where, there are so many platforms for engaging who your different audiences are. So when you're in a crisis mode, you always have to remember that you're not talking, you have so many different constituents. It's your employees who are listening to you. It's it's your consumers, perhaps on social. It could be investors, who, could be, who are maybe reading the paper or have their Twitter feed, listening to what reporters saying. And so a lot of times what we do, and what we really do is, when we come up with a guidance of, and it comes from your values. I think people can smell BS so easily. And a lot of
Any
times,
apology that has an if in it, for instance.
absolutely right. And if there are, and your statements really have to ring true. That if you're going to be apologetic, you need to, I think, acknowledge what it is, what the fault is, and really be apologetic while keeping the company safe, within the confines, which is what our legal counsel is there for us to do, so that we don't face lawsuits.
Julie, how do you? It takes a lot of courage to push back on a CEO or the CFO or the C-suite or the corporate lawyer. But it's a key skill of a communicator, and you are sort of the glue that binds all the different parts of the organization. So how do you develop those skills and that courage?
Absolutely. And I remember being, earlier in my career feeling like, well, the lawyer said that's what we can say, that's what we're going to say, even though in your gut it doesn't feel right.
Right.
And we have these jobs, I'm sure all of you have your jobs, because you have great gut instincts and it's trying to tell you something. And what I've learned works with the lawyers is to say, sure, we can do that. In my experience, I'm concerned that the response is going to be X, or the next question is going to be Y, or it may read okay as 2 lines and part of a story that we can shape, but on social media, it's going to sound like corporate jargon. And it helps enormously if you have some of those relationships already in place well before the crisis hits.
Absolutely.
And we work, my PR team and I work extremely closely with both the lawyers at ABC and the standards people at ABC News. And I find all of them to be great partners, because at the end of the day, we're all trying to protect the reputation of something that's incredibly important to us, in the traditions of ABC News.
Rich, in that context, the head of communications at United reported into HR and now reports into the General Counsel, I believe. How important is it for the Chief Communications Officer to report into the CEO, especially when a crisis hits?
Well, that's the ideal. I would say either the CEO or maybe a COO, but again, I've seen too many communications departments reporting into HR. is the worst. It's the worst. Maybe next to reporting into the legal guys. That's not where communications belongs. Communications needs a seat at the table. And if that means you're reporting to the COO or the CEO, that's fine. But particularly when a crisis hits, there are still too many organizations out there where the senior communications person does not have a seat at that key table, and they're brought in afterwards. And they have to have somebody relate the whole situation to them, and then they have to try and formulate a plan. However, if that communications person is at that main table, there's a lot that he or she can add to that conversation that may save time. It may certainly add value to whatever the plan is that the company or the firm ultimately comes up with.
Yeah. Tony, from the agency point of view, where do you fit into that process and structure? Because you're another step removed, but good agency relationships mean you are sort of part of the team. So how does that work in a crisis?
I think I'm going to quote a little bit of a data point that Weber Shandwick had published probably about a year ago, talking about the CEO reputation and how it affects a company's reputation. And what they found overwhelmingly, as they were gauging, asking consumers, how does what you feel about a CEO affect a company's brand? And the overwhelming response was very. And we live in an environment, of the Steve Jobs and Howard Schultz's. You have CEOs who are, even if they don't want to, really become the mastheads and become, the people who represent what a brand's value is. And so, in that sense, where we come in, is from that counselor standpoint was, listen, it may not be your fault as a CEO in terms of what happened in this specific instance, but know that your reputation and how you handle it really has a big halo effect on how your overall corporate brand really is seen by the rest of the country. People don't really care. People don't make that difference anymore between what a CEO is and what the brand is. And so, how we work with clients, in that standpoint is we come in, really as an outsider to say, listen, we've talked to reporters, and we have, we activate our social media monitoring system. And one of the things that's powerful for us is to be able to walk into a room, with everyone on the crisis team and say, this is what we're seeing out there. You're seeing 15,000 tweets using this particular hashtag about your company, that's negative. And frankly, this, you really need to take action, fairly quickly to do that. So, that's where we can add in a lot of value.
Julie, that's a key part of the process, isn't it? Deciding when and how to react, or even if you should react, because you shouldn't react. Sometimes the best thing to do is nothing. Some of the best crises are a crisis averted where the story never rose to the surface. So how do you approach that?
Yeah, so we had a situation last year or the year before. The View, the famous daytime talk show, was part of the news division. And the ladies...
Good key message got over there, like.
Only broadcast daytime television show up year to year. Only one managing to talk about politics on broadcast television successfully right now. ABC at 11.
Anyway.
What was the question?
When do you decide what to do and how to, and if you should react?
The other thing I would say, and I will get right to that, but about where communications sit as an organization, I'm incredibly fortunate. For most of my career, I've worked for one media company or another where communications is always reported directly into the CEO. Right now, as head of the communications department for ABC News, I report to the president of the news division. So when you need to respond quickly for something, it means I essentially, when time is of the essence, I can make one phone call. So our Twitter feed was hacked earlier this year at about 6:30 in the morning, maybe a little bit earlier. It was right before GMA was getting ready to go on the air. And you could just see the volume of interest cranking up on that. We were already starting to get calls from the wire services, and it was taking on a life of its own on social media, as you can imagine. And because of who I report to, I can call the president of the news division and say, I think we need to put something out on social that acknowledges that this has happened, that acknowledges we have locked down our accounts and says we're working on the problem. And then as soon as we have more, we can put that out there.
That's your holding statement.
And within minutes, we had that out into the world, and the press stories, instead of being about the fact that our account was hacked and all the terrible things that were being said from it on our behalf, actually were about how quickly we had responded to the problem, and acknowledged that it was almost like it was just that for media reporters, is our response to it, our successful response to it, was as interesting as what had
That's
actually
so interesting.
happened.
So the response that you gave was on Twitter itself. You used Twitter to say,
Yep.
hey, we fixed this problem.
Yeah, one of the things that we've been spending a lot of time on, and in particular for crisis communications, is how, as a PR team, we're using our own social media handles. What we want to do as the PR team is a little bit different than, say, what the ABC News accounts are doing to either promote their shows, to gather news and information for reporting purposes, or for marketing to drive tune-in. So we may want to brag about the fact that David Muir, World News Tonight with David Muir, was the most watched evening newscast for the first time in 21 years since Peter Jennings was an anchor. It may or may not be appropriate for the World News Tonight Twitter feed to brag about that. That's not what they're designed to do. But we've also found our feeds and our handles to be incredibly effective in responding in a crisis, and that was a good test of it.
Does that mean that a PR person now has to change the sort of hours they work, or have they always been 24/7? It seems much more 24/7 now.
Well, like I said, I've always worked for one media company or another. They are by their very nature, especially when you're in news 24/7. But it would be hard to imagine doing these jobs without being on all the time.
But for Rich, maybe you can talk to this, especially as you've got incredibly global role. I hear stories of comms teams on the West Coast now having someone on duty at 2:30, 3:30 in the morning in case they get tweeted about by a certain person. And I hear from media professionals that those calls that they used to put in at 5 or 6 in the morning to the media teams, and they would always get an answer machine, now are very often being picked up. So is this changing the profession and changing the way you have to structure your team?
Oh, I think so. I think for the most part, communications departments have to reflect the media. I mean, these are sort of their clients in effect. And nowadays, well, let me go back. In the old days, if you wanted to bury a bad story, or if you wanted to hide something.
Can't believe that ever happens, Rich.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's, you can get quite good at it and very clever. You could release it in Singapore on Friday night of a 3-day weekend in the US and cross your fingers that nobody sees it. That doesn't happen anymore. Something that breaks, in Moscow can be in New York in a split second. So the world has gotten much smaller. And one of the things that I tell a lot of people internally when we talk about these types of things is that, publications like Fortune or Forbes, I remember in the old days, the reporters there used to pray that whatever news scoops they got would hold until their deadline so that it would appear in the magazine. Magazine is one of those glossy things. And nowadays, every publication, whether it's Fortune, Forbes, if they come across news, it's going to be on their website. So every news organization, every publication is a wire service in effect, and we have to reflect that. So if they're working and they can publish 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, we have to be ready to respond to that.
It also means that the accuracy and the levels through which the content or the copy goes through are fewer, and even on mainstream, dare I say it, media organizations. So you have to check the stories out and get them corrected quickly as well, I would imagine.
Well, that's right, and I'm sorry, Tony. The competition, particularly online now, the competition is so great that I have heard senior editors at some of these online publications say that if they can't get a response from you in 10 minutes, they're going with it. And I said, well, how many sources do you have? Well, we got one trusted source. No, and I've even had arguments with the Wall Street Journal online, saying they're going out with something in 15 minutes, and they're very confident of the story that they have. And I said, listen, that's just not fair. Give me a chance to get our people. We didn't anticipate this. They could be in meetings. They could be traveling somewhere. I said, you got to give me a fair amount of time. And ultimately, I did convince the reporter, which was good because they were open-minded. But this is the kind of pressure that they're under. They really have to get it immediately.
That's the sort of comes in the preparation part of the building relationships. Still really important. The media relations part of the job still really important. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Tony, maybe you can speak to that because that's where an agency can help support, isn't it, as well, and guide the client.
Well, I think that I think I don't with so many channels that are out there, it is really, it can be daunting, like, do we say something on Twitter? Do we say something on LinkedIn? Do we say something on Facebook? Do we do this on our corporate blog? And if on any of those channels, does your CEO have their own handle? Is there a corporate handle? Is there a brand handle? Which ones do you use? And part of the agency's job really is to help keeping the channels clean, meaning that if you have a brand and all you're doing with that brand is to promote that specific product, don't soil that with a response, to any kind of crisis if it's not directly affected by it, because you don't want to dirty your channels. But to the greater point of like how important is media relations, just keeping relationships with reporters, I would have to say that in this world still, nothing drives a narrative, and ultimately that's what we want to do. We want to drive the right narrative for our clients, like a New York Times or Wall Street Journal. That a good New York Times story, a good ABC story, something that really, that's really national, can dictate how other secondary reporters, journalism write that interview. And so it's so important to get that right in the first run.
Yeah, and I think that really all comes down to relationships. And cup of coffee, a drink after work, it's old school, but it's still valuable and it still works.
Some of those things are still
And I
important.
think to that point, we spend even more time thinking about who we're going to give a story to exclusively, because how important it is now that people aren't going to read your press release. They're going to follow what they read in the trade story or in a Times story. And you don't want somebody to call and say, you have 15 minutes to respond to something I've been working on for 4 or 5 days.
That's right. That's right.
And so, you can turn the tables, and you can pick the person that you want to write it, who will hear you out, and give you a fair shake. So when everybody is in a rush to follow the breaking news, at least they're following something that is accurate.
Well, not only that, but if you're giving an exclusive and it's a pretty juicy story, they are going to work with you, and they may even give you the benefit of the doubt here or there because you're giving them an exclusive. Because if they don't play ball with you, you say, well, I'll give it to the guy down the block, So that still works too.
Can you prepare for a crisis, Julie? I mean, that example you quoted where you had a response out in 15 minutes, what elements of that came from preparation and having good systems in place, and what was on the hoof and you had to make quick decisions?
I would say that most of the crises that I have dealt with in my career were not things I could have predicted. The Twitter feed hack that I mentioned, it just so happened there was another media organization, maybe even the Times, that had been hacked the week before. Absolutely. I consume every piece of media I can get my hands on. And when I see somebody has a good statement, you better believe I file that away. If that counts as being prepared, So, it's helpful to the extent that you can think about. I don't know that my team sits down at the beginning of the year and looks at our crisis communications playbook. We certainly don't. But to the extent that something happens to another media company, and I think, well, what would we do if we were in that situation? Those are conversations that we absolutely have.
Do you run through crisis simulations, Rich?
No.
So how do you prep, and how does it work at Mitsubishi?
I've been with companies that have notebooks of crisis planning and with the nice little tabs and the colors and all this other stuff, and it takes weeks, sometimes months to put it together. And I know that the agencies like to sell those things at a very high price. I have found that we almost never open that book when the crisis hits. I mean, there might be like I said before, a holding statement that might come in handy, but you just can't anticipate what it's going to be, even with the best planning.
Even with the nuts and bolts, like contacts and people who you must run stuff by, and the legal and the regulatory bit.
You should always have, key phone numbers and email addresses for all the people that are critical for these types of things. In that sense, you can prepare. But as far as predicting or trying to anticipate, what you're going to say and how you're going to say it and with whom, that's tough.
So Tony, what is the best way you can help your clients prepare for a crisis?
I have opinions about preparation, which I think it's possible. and as PR professionals, I think one of the most powerful tools we have really is that relationship that you talk about. Like, who are your beat reporters? Name and know all the beat reporters that cover your industry, and have that drink, have that beer often. And the other thing to do, make sure they know your narrative. Like, your job isn't, when you're having a coffee with a reporter, is not only just get to know them, but get them to know what your company's about, what you're doing, and what is the narrative you want them to take away from you? What do you want them to understand about your company? Because when crisis hits, they're going to have that filed away. Okay, this company, was all about, these are their three main objectives. This crisis, how does this fit in? How does this crisis fit into that narrative? And I think that's half the job of a crisis, is trying to correct any kind of misinformation out there. And if your beat reporters have your narrative because you've spoken to them, that's one of the best ways you can prepare for it. And I think nowadays, I keep going back to all the different channels that people communicate. Weber Shandwick, sells a tool, but it's not a binder.
Okay.
It's a simulation, and I think that's and simulations are the best way that you can use, that you sit people in a room, and simulations, I think by design have to be about very specific things. So the best kind of simulation you can buy really is about, I have this thing coming up, I'm launching something, there may be something controversial about it. How do we know, how can we best prepare for things that we don't know about? So you build a social crisis, and you do it with all the comms people and your lawyers, and say, what's the worst that people can throw at us? And you hire like really good people who just like can write the meanest things about you, and you run your comms team through that. You run them through the ringer and say, hey, I just got tweeted that your product causes cancer. You're in the moment. How do you respond? And I think that nothing prepares like trying something out.
So I want to open it up for questions after this next one. So do think about what you want to ask the panel. I think we've got a roving mic, or you may have to come up to the front. But just before we get into that, give us some war stories. Sometimes it goes wrong, and I know you love talking about that. And if it does, how can you correct it? Everybody makes mistakes. No one has a 100% hit rate. So Julie, why don't you start? Is there something you can give us on that?
Well, so I started to tell the story about what The View had gone through a couple of years ago. They were talking about, of all things, the Miss America pageant, and a couple of the ladies made a comment that they simply couldn't understand what somebody's costume was. And one of the contestants was a nurse, and she was there in her scrubs with a stethoscope around her neck. And the confusion at the table about what her costume was and why she was wearing it for the talent portion of the contest got misconstrued as the ladies of The View don't respect nurses. Talk
Never
about a group you do not want to get on the wrong side of for all sorts of reasons. And the thing that was actually interesting about it is that it really never became a media story. My phone was not ringing off the hook with media reporters demanding to know how we could have insulted the nursing profession. It was a social media crisis almost entirely. And our first response was to apologize on social media, on the Twitter and Facebook page, because that's where we were seeing people reacting to this. And that didn't work. They addressed it on the show, and a person who was new to the panel, who had never done this before and was nervous, instead of just reading what had been prepared, she ad-libbed a joke, which made it worse. And it was amazing how we're watching the volume of social media feedback and the sentiment of it, which was obviously all negative. And it was sort of like going like this, and then it just went like through the roof, like into space. And then it was trying to figure, again, like, this was an entirely new environment for me. If media reporters were calling me, it would have been as simple as showing them the video of what they had actually been said on the show, explaining the context of what they were talking about, giving them the apology that had been made twice at that point. And because I have longstanding relationships with all of these people, I think I would have felt fairly comfortable that I knew how that was going to play out. And it was really challenging to do the things we thought we needed to do, even if they weren't executed perfectly, and see it getting worse and not better. What we did was by day 2 or 3, it all started to run together. We invited 30 nurses from hospitals all over the city to come onto the show and talk about what their profession is like. And of course, we made sure they had the best possible appearance anyone in television has ever had. And we also made a round of calls from the very most senior ranks of the leadership team in the news division to the head of several of the trade associations, the nursing associations, the labor unions that work with nurses, and made sure that our apology was loud, was clear, and was heartfelt. And it was amazing and incredibly satisfying that after that round of effort, to see the tide turn. To this day, again, you do not want to get on the wrong side of the nurses.
So you turn the conversation into how fantastic nursing community
exactly.
is, which was a bit like us when we made Oscar Munoz our Communicator of the Year 1 month before that famous incident on the plane. We managed to turn that into a conversation about how important crisis response was in these situations, and I guess that's what you've got to do. How about you, Tony?
I think it's really impossible to have this conversation, to really talk about this topic, without talking about how politicized our entire profession, has been, or entire media has been, since the election of our new president. And like one of the biggest, I think, crises that some of our clients have seen really is around whether the president mentions you in a positive or negative way, and especially if you are a brand that really sells to if you're a giant global brand that sells to every type of person, you don't want to be on either side, and you see the negative reaction really coming in from both the right and the left. And I think the most recent thing that we saw was the advisory councils, and how politicized that has been. I think from an audience standpoint, and what we and the kind of work from a counseling standpoint we did there really was to help our clients really clarify, what is the issue at hand here? Is it really appropriate for you to speak out? And what are you speaking out about? How do you mitigate? How do you balance the fact of that there is a lot of feelings about this president versus is there something on a bigger, greater social issue that really reflects what your brand stands for? And to have that conversation was probably like some of the toughest, because you really no brand really had to face that ever.
Yeah, very difficult to have those conversations in 140 characters as well, which is where the context of a lot of this stuff is taking place. Rich, what's your war story you want to share with us?
Well, it probably, the biggest event of my career, we're going to have to go back a few years, is 9/11. And I was working at Merrill Lynch at the time, and I was director of global media. And when the first plane hit, I was working out, didn't really know what was going on. When the second plane hit, I saw it from about here to there. And we suffered casualties in the firm, including one person on my staff. So we didn't use the binder that day. Sorry, Tony. And it was pretty much think on your feet, pretty quick. And I had people on my staff that stopped showing up because they were friendly with the guy that was killed. And it was a crazy, crazy couple of weeks. This was something that stretched out for a long time. No phones, no computer connections. We had to host conference calls via Toronto. To this day, I don't really know how they did it. I was on it, and I'm not even sure how I got on it because most of our phones weren't working. But I took, with permission from the CEO, I took a reporter from the Wall Street Journal a couple days after that down to the site of the Trade Center and walked them around sort of our offices, which were across the street. And we walked around downtown a little bit. And, you know, on one hand, he wrote a great story about us, which was nice. But on the other hand, it was like a war zone. And, you know, even I can't believe it's 16 years ago, because the memories and the emotions are still so raw for me. And, you know, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. But with the team that I had there, the ones that did show up, I'm very proud of the effort that we gave that day and in the weeks after.
Yeah, those experiences make you stronger as a team, but also as a professional, I guess. The head of comms at United was head of comms at the airline of the plane that landed on the Hudson. So he'd already had a pretty good, you know, training in those areas and experiences that really you can't buy. Not that you'd want to buy them. Right, who's got a question for the panel? Got one at the back there. Do you want them, if you come to the front and just say who you are and where you're from?
Yeah, if you don't mind, anyone who has a question, you can even line up so we can hear everyone by the mic.
Hi, I'm Deb Falk. I do communications for New Jersey Public Television, NJTV. I typically err on the side of caution, and it's a butting of heads with the CEO and some of our other higher-ups sometimes because they want to be reactionary. Can you share an experience, much like a war story that you just shared, where saying nothing ended up being the right choice, and whether you met any resistance in making that choice for the company?
Yeah, go ahead, Rich.
Yeah, we have a situation right now which I can't talk about, and
Go on, you're amongst friends.
yeah, I don't think so. Not the friends part.
No one's tweeting about this, are they? No.
One of the things that I've said to the bankers at my place is I believe that out of professional courtesy, 98% of the time, even if you don't want to respond to the question, professional courtesy demands that you go back to the reporter and say, sorry, we're not really going to comment to that, or policy, or whatever you want to say. But there is that 2% I find where you really don't want to be in that story at all. And as a former reporter, I don't like to say this, but we just don't return the phone call. And I mean, so you make a choice of saying, you know, your company, your institution declined to comment. That's one choice if you return the call. The other choice is that you hope, with your fingers crossed, that they keep your company or your institution's name out of the story entirely.
That's interesting, because the example you mentioned earlier, where you've got 15 minutes to respond, you'll be said they could not be reached for comment, whereas in that scenario, you're saying
That's right.
decline to comment, or yeah.
We didn't return it. In fact, I got something on my voicemail right now that I'm not returning.
In a similar
I thought you were all about relationships with reporters. I'm not getting this.
When the reporters pay my salary, then I'll worry about that.
When it's safe, you can apologize profusely for not getting that back to them immediately. Yeah, I find sometimes we get contacted for trend stories. You know, people want to know how the media is feeling about X, Y, and Z, or what is the media's feeling about X, Y, and Z. And that's sometimes really hard for me, because sometimes it'll be an AP reporter who I have a great relationship with, who I've known for a long time. The last thing I want to do is not help him on a story. But I also do the calculus in my head. Am I going to be the only one to respond? Do I think NBC, CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, you know, are they, because if they don't respond, and I do, out of a sense of like responsibility to this relationship, then all of a sudden my news division is probably the headline and the lead of that story. So we think really carefully about those.
Are you all friendly, the heads of comms, because you have common issues?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you know, I mean, and the other thing I think that's really helpful too, you know, as the communicators really in your organization, a lot of, you know, you can, you know, half your job really is to educate the people that you're counseling. And so, you know, we sometimes, you know, we will have bloggers who, you know, or you know, bloggers who write about us, or like, you know, call in and say, hey, do you want to respond to something either on Twitter or like back when Gawker was around, and you knew you had reporters that were trying to make a joke about your client's brand, and no matter what you say, you were going to be a part of that joke. So the education part is, listen, this is not something that we can ever win by participating. And it's giving your client, giving the person that you're supporting that context of, this is a bad idea, better stay silent.
Spare a thought for my reporters, because they have to ring these people and ask them, get them to talk about their crises. So and it's a double whammy. They're talking about inside baseball. Megan, have we got time for one more question, or are we out of time? You didn't hold your bits of paper up. I'm very disappointed.
Quick question. Hey, Chris Bittendorf from Edelman. I guess a quick question for Tony. Sometimes in a crisis situation, you have clients that are potentially so vile, like a Harvey Weinstein, for example. Do you guys have a protocol in place for refusing clients? And in your experience, has there ever been a client that you have not taken on, whether it's for personal values or the company's values?
We should be asking you that as well, out of balance, Chris, shouldn't we?
I have recused myself from one client in my career, yes.
Which one, mate?
I don't know if I can say that.
It's such an important calculation, and especially as a professional, when I talked about before about helping a client really find what their value is, what your brand stands for. Same goes for counselors. Are you really need to have that calculation of, am I supporting an organization that in good conscience that I can do that? And oftentimes I think we refuse business because of, this is just not work we want to get into. And there are so many people that can use the technical help, but frankly, it's just not a good position to put ourselves in.
Actually, that panel I mentioned at Advertising Week was Ketchum, another PR agency, announcing a partnership with the Weinstein Company on brand filmmaking. And to their credit, when it broke, very quickly we were ringing for comment and doing our due diligence. And they did cancel that partnership. So they did make a fairly quick decision. And I think credit to them on that. It's easy to look at that scenario in retrospect, but this is something that changes very quickly. And another client of theirs was Russia, for example, which back in 2008, when they took the client on, was in one place, part of the G8, etc., and then the narrative changes. And so I guess those things are movable as well. A client might be okay at one point, but not necessarily another. All right, I think we are done. So I'd love you to give a round of applause to our panel. Thanks for listening.